South Pass, Wyoming Territory, winter of 1891. Cabins crouched against a wind that never asked permission. Every settler followed the same rule: build the fireplace flat against a wall, stack wood high, and pray the stones would hold. But one man turned his back on that rule. His name was Orrin Oakley, a quiet frontier builder known more for his work than his words. His reticence wasn't born of shyness, but of a colder memory. Years spent as a stone setter for the railroad crews and mining camps. There, he had seen men freeze to death, learning the hard lesson that a man could die not from a lack of fire, but from a proper fireplace built in the wrong place. He had watched standard hearths roar their heat straight up the flue while the corners of a room grew a skin of ice. That memory was why, inside his half-finished cabin, he dragged heavy stone into a corner and set his firebox on a hard diagonal, 42 degrees off both walls, wasting space everyone else needed. Neighbors watched, shook their heads, and laughed. Elias Boone, a seasoned local cabin builder, called it foolish work. Wade Larkin, the most respected stonemason in the pass, said no family could afford such a crooked, stone-hungry mistake. They saw lost floor space. They saw extra labor. They saw winter coming fast and firewood still uncut. Orrin saw something else. He saw two walls that could store heat instead of one. He saw stone as a slow battery, not a decoration. Then, the cold arrived. Not a breeze, not a frost, but a killing wind that froze hinges, split logs, and turned breath into needles. Thermometers fell to -27. Fires roared. Walls wept ice. Standard fireplaces burned hard and lost their heat straight up the chimney. Boone's cabin struggled at 45 degrees. Blankets piled high as wood vanished by the armload. Orrin's crooked corner held steady at 69. Warm air moved to every plank. The stone walls stayed warm long after the flames sank to coals. He burned less than half the wood of his neighbors. The difference measured 24 full degrees between survival and slow freezing. What looked stupid on a clear autumn day became a quiet engine of life when nature opened court. Watch the angle. Remember the corner. Because in this country, the wrong place for a fireplace can kill. Inside most cabins, heat clung to the hearth and died a few steps away. But the right place can change how an entire frontier survives. In Orrin's cabin, warmth traveled the long way around, circling the room and feeding the stone, returning through the night like a tide that refused to leave. On the frontier, knowledge that kept a family warm was the most valuable thing you could share. It was passed from hand to hand, too precious to be lost. If you believe this kind of hard-earned wisdom is worth keeping alive, help us pass it on. A like tells us these stories are still worth telling, and subscribing ensures you'll have a seat by the fire for the next lesson learned from the past. Before the deep freeze ever came, the real race was against the calendar. Late autumn at South Pass gave no gentle warnings. The first hard wind off the high ridges meant the working season was already over. Anything not finished now would be finished in snow. Cabins went up fast in this country for a reason. Walls were squared, roofs were sealed, and fireplaces were set flat against a single wall. Not because it was perfect, but because it was quick. Quick meant time to cut wood, time to stack it high and keep it dry, time to do the one job winter always demanded more of. Every extra day spent on stone was a day stolen from the woodpile, and an empty woodpile was a death sentence written in advance. The rule passed from hand to hand like an old tool. Build simple. Build proven. Build it the way the last man survived. Elias Boone carried that rule in his bones. He had seen storms come early and stay late. He had seen careful men run out of fuel anyway. To him, a fireplace was not a place for ideas. It was a place for speed and certainty. Set it against the wall. Seal the seams. Move on to the axe. Across the settlement, the sound of splitting logs never stopped. Iron bit into pine and juniper from dawn to dark. Each swing said the same thing. Winter is coming faster than you think. Wind slid through the gaps between rough boards and answered back. It whistled low and steady, a reminder that the mountains kept no mercy in reserve. No one feared hard work. They feared wasted time. Because on this pass, a man could survive a crooked wall. He could survive a leaking roof for a while, but he could not survive a cold season without enough wood. So the unwritten law held firm. Do not overbuild the hearth. Do not linger on stone. Finish the fireplace. Grab the axe, and pray the pile of split logs would be tall enough when the wind returned to judge them all. While axes rose and fell across the settlement, one man worked with a cord instead of a blade. Orrin Oakley knelt in the mud inside his half-finished cabin. A hemp line ran tight from one wall to the other, pulled across the square corner like the string of a bow. The two walls met at a clean right angle, 90 degrees of frontier habit, 90 degrees of everyone doing the same thing. Orrin did not mark the wall. He marked the diagonal. He pressed a charcoal nub against the plank floor and drew a dark line at 42 degrees, cutting the corner into two equal triangles of empty space. Outside, the steady crack of splitting wood paused. Elias Boone stood in the doorway, axe resting on his shoulder. He watched the line take shape and frowned, not in anger, but in disbelief. "That's not where a fireplace goes," he said plainly. Orrin kept the cord taut, checked the angle again, and shifted a stone an inch to the left. Mud clung to his knees. He did not look up. Boone stepped inside, boots thudding on bare boards. He set the axe down against the wall that every other man would have used. "Set it here," Boone said, tapping the planks. "Flat, solid, done in a day, same as always." The wind slid through the roof beams and tugged at the hanging cord. It hummed softly against the tight line, stretched across the right angle. Orrin pinned the cord with his thumb and redrew the mark. The diagonal held. Boone shook his head. "You're throwing away space and time. Winter won't wait for clever ideas." Silence answered him. Orrin finally spoke without lifting his eyes from the floor. "Build to hold heat," he said, "not to look right." Boone let out a slow breath through his nose. He had heard stubborn before. This sounded different. Not pride, not defiance, just certainty that refused to explain itself. The cabin corner sat there, split by a single dark line. One path led to the wall every man trusted. The other cut across it, quiet and unyielding. Boone picked up his axe and stepped back into the wind. Behind him, the hemp cord stayed tight, dividing the square like a challenge no one had asked for. And in the empty corner, the first stone of a crooked hearth waited to be set. By the third day, the diagonal was no longer just a line on the floor. A shallow trench cut across the corner, biting 14 inches into each wall. Heavy stones lay stacked beside it, dark soapstone blocks and dense slabs of basalt waiting their turn. Word traveled fast in a small settlement. Before noon, Wade Larkin stepped through the doorway with a steel square and a short level tucked under his arm. He did not rush to speak. He measured first. The steel square met the walls. The bubble in the level settled dead center. Then his eyes followed the trench and stopped at the angle. He exhaled slowly. "That's not a hearth," he said. "That's a project." Orrin set another stone into the trench and packed wet mortar around its base. He did not argue. Larkin crouched and ran a calloused hand along the cut foundation. 14 inches into one wall, 14 into the other. He stood and looked at the pile of stone again, judging weight by sight alone. "You're looking at 3,600 pounds before you're done," he said. "Maybe more." Ansel Kruger, a settler raised on older European building tales, but unsure they belonged here, hovered near the doorway, hat in his hands. He listened without stepping closer, eyes moving between the stones and the shrinking patch of open floor. Larkin lifted the level and set it across the diagonal line. The tool looked out of place there, as if it had been asked to bless a crooked idea. "Too much stone," he went on. "Too many cuts. Too much time." The wind pressed against the cabin walls, low and steady. "A man can build 2 good wall hearths in the time this will take," Larkin said, "and heat 2 cabins for what this one will cost." Orrin pressed mortar into a seam and wiped his hands clean on a rag. He checked the angle once more, then set another block. Kruger shifted his weight. He knew Larkin's work across 3 valleys. Straight, square, dependable. Larkin tapped the steel square against the wall every other hearth would have used. Stone is only as good as where you put it, he said. More rock won't save you if it sits wrong. For a moment, the corner looked smaller, tighter, almost trapped by its own weight. Each new stone felt like a gamble against the clock outside. Kruger pictured his own half-built fireplace back home, simple and nearly finished. He imagined the hours still left to cut wood. Behind them, Orrin reached for the next block without hesitation. To the trained eye, it looked like a man burying time he could never get back. The work did not move quickly, and that was the point. Each morning, Orrin and Nate, a young helper learning the trade at his side, walked the creek bed below the pass. They did not gather the first stone that fit the hand. They tested every piece by weight. Soapstone came up dark and smooth, heavy for its size. It felt almost warm even in the cold water. Orrin kept those. Lighter rock went back into the stream. Nate learned to judge without looking. He lifted, paused, and felt the pull in his forearm. If the stone sagged the wrist, it stayed. If it feels too light, Orrin said, it will cool too fast. Back at the cabin, those dense blocks formed the heart of the corner. Basalt lined the throat and firebox, black and hard, chosen to take heat without cracking. The mortar was mixed slow, clay dug from the cut bank. Fine river sand sifted through fingers. Wood ash folded in until the paste turned the color of old iron. Nate stirred with both hands on the paddle. The mix thickened and dragged like wet earth. Not smooth, Orrin said. Strong. Every joint was packed tight and struck clean. No wide seams. No hollow pockets for cold air to hide. The diagonal rose one course at a time. Orrin checked the angle with the cord before every new layer. If a stone wandered a fraction off line, it came back out. 2 days passed, then 4, then 7. Across the settlement, other hearths were already lit for the first test fires. Here, the corner was only halfway to a man's chest. Nate's palms blistered and hardened. His shoulders ached from lifting blocks that never seemed to get lighter. Still, the pace did not change. Each soapstone face was turned inward, toward the future fire. Each basalt edge was set where flame would strike first. Orrin weighed every piece in his hands before letting it join the wall. If it did not feel right, it did not stay. A bad stone steals heat, he said once quietly, and a stolen night can kill a family. The work stretched into its second week. Lines stayed straight along the diagonal. Corners met true where the trench bit into both walls. By the time the hearth reached its full height, the floor space lost to the angle looked small beside the mass of stone gained. Nothing about it was quick. Nothing about it was easy. But every block in that corner could hold warmth long after the fire died. Each one, set by hand and judged by weight, was expected to earn its place through a winter night without flame. When the last stone of the firebox was set, the shape finally made sense to the eye. The opening did not face a wall. It faced the room on a slant. A dark mouth cut across the corner, 34 inches wide and 22 inches tall. Nate stood back and frowned at it. Why not turn it straight? He asked. It would be easier. Orrin brushed grit from his hands and looked at the 2 walls meeting behind the hearth. Straight heats one wall, he said. Crooked heats 2. He stepped into the empty cabin and pointed to the left face of the firebox, then to the right. When the fire burns, heat hits both sides at once. He dragged his finger in an arc across the air of the room. It spreads out instead of stopping short. Nate imagined the flames leaning forward, light and heat thrown wide instead of flat. Orrin tapped the soapstone block buried deep in the left wall. Then the matching block sunk into the right. 2 walls storing heat, he said, twice the stone holding it. He measured the angle with the cord one more time. 42 degrees from each wall. Not guessed. Set. Most hearths lose more than half their warmth up the chimney, he went on. This throws it back into the room. He held his hands out from the angled opening, palms up, as if warming them over an invisible flame. About 7 parts out of 10 come back here, he said, sweeping his arm across the empty floorboards. Nate glanced at the ceiling. And the smoke? He asked. The corner pulls better, Orrin answered. Air turns instead of stalling. He traced a tight spiral in the dust with his boot heel. About a 10th stronger draw. Cleaner burn, less waste. The idea settled slowly. Heat would not stop at the hearth. It would strike both walls, sink into stone, and return through the night. Nate walked to the far side of the cabin and pressed his palm against the bare plank. He could almost picture it already. Warmth spreading in a wide, slow curve instead of a hard, narrow stripe. Stone keeps heat, Oren said at last, like a mountain keeps snow. The corner no longer looked crooked. It looked aimed, not at the wall, at the whole room. The hearth stood finished at last, but the yard outside told another story. Wood piles rose behind every other cabin. Straight stacks, clean rows, winter, counted in cords. Behind Oren's cabin, the pile was smaller. Boone noticed it first. He walked the edge of the stacked logs, eyes measuring height and depth the way he once measured walls. "That corner cost you wood," he said quietly. "Days you should have spent at the axe." He did the math without paper. 2 weeks on stone, 2 weeks less on fuel. On this pass, that difference could empty a hearth before spring. Kruger shifted his weight beside him, watching the angled opening from a careful distance. "All that stone," he muttered. "What if the smoke hangs low?" He pictured wind driving down the flue, fire choking, cold air spilling across the floor. A corner could trap heat. A corner could trap smoke. Larkin studied the finished work with arms folded. No loose joints, no crooked lines. Still, his jaw stayed set. "This kind of work belongs in towns," he said. "Not out here where every hour has a price." He gestured toward the growing stacks of firewood across the clearing. "Frontier families heat with time and timber," he went on, "not with clever stonework." The wind picked up and rattled loose shingles somewhere down the slope. Boone looked again at the shorter pile of logs. He imagined a long winter night and an empty rack beside the hearth. A simple wall fireplace might waste heat, but it never stole time from the axe. Kruger glanced at the chimney throat, uneasy. "If the draft turns wrong," he said, "you'll have cold feet and stinging eyes." Larkin gave a final shake of his head. "People out here can't afford experiments." None of them spoke from spite. Each spoke from winters already survived. The rule had always been clear. Build what is known. Stack more wood. Because if the new way failed, no one would remember the idea. They would only remember the cold. The first real snow came without ceremony. It drifted down through the pass in thin, steady sheets, covering roofs and wood piles in a clean white skin. Smoke rose from every chimney, dark against the pale sky. Inside most cabins, the first fires of the season were fed hard and often. Logs were thrown on in heavy armloads. Heat pushed fast against a single wall. In Oren's cabin, the fire was smaller. 2 tight bundles of lodgepole pine each evening. No more. Boone counted them without meaning to. He passed by at dusk, again at dawn, and saw the same measure carried in. Not the frantic hauling he expected, just the same quiet routine. Curiosity pulled him to the doorway one morning before the sun cleared the ridge. He stepped inside without a word. The air felt even, not hot near the hearth and cold at his back, just steady. A thin sheet of tin hung on the far wall, fixed there as a makeshift reflector. In most cabins, that metal would bead with frost overnight. Here, it stayed dry. Kruger arrived a moment later, breath fogging as he crossed the threshold. He looked at the tin first, then at the water bucket set on a low stool near the opposite corner. No ice skin floated on its surface. He bent closer, expecting to find warmth only near the fire. Instead, the floorboards beneath his boots felt mild all the way across the room. Boone moved to the far wall and laid his palm flat against the planks. They were not cold, not warm like fresh stone by the flame, but not dead and frozen either. Heat had reached the edges. No sharp line marked where comfort ended and winter began. No single hot spot held all the warmth hostage. The angled opening burned quietly behind them, flames leaning into the corner instead of clawing at the wall. Kruger frowned, searching for the trick. "Not much wood," he said. Boone glanced at the tidy stack beside the hearth. 2 bundles gone. No more taken. Outside, wind brushed snow against the cabin sides. Inside, nothing cracked or creaked from sudden chill. The warmth moved in a slow circle, touching every board before fading. Neither man spoke for a long moment. Pride held its ground, but doubt had begun to thaw. By the third day of steady snow, the air itself began to feel different. Not colder yet, just heavier. Silas Crowell, an old trapper who had buried friends after a deadly winter decades earlier, stood outside the trading shed with a small brass barometer in his palm. He watched the needle sink, not a sudden drop, a slow, stubborn fall that did not stop. He licked a finger and held it to the wind. The gust came down from the high gap, dry and sharp, with no softness left in it. Snow skittered low across the ground instead of drifting. Silas had felt this before. He did not raise his voice when he spoke. "This is the same air," he said. "Same pressure. Same wind that killed men on their own floors." A few settlers laughed it off at first. Early winter always scared someone. Silas did not argue. He only tapped the glass face of the barometer with a bent knuckle. "Watch that needle," he said quietly. "When it settles low and stays there, the cold won't move." The wind pushed harder through the pass, a steady breath from somewhere far north. Clouds thinned instead of thickening. The sky turned pale and empty. No storm wall, no warning thunder, just open air waiting to freeze solid. Silas looked toward the cabins scattered along the slope. "When that kind of cold sits down," he said, "it judges every stone and every stack of wood. No man could bargain with it. No door could shut it out." The court of winter was about to open. The temperature fell past 0 and did not climb back. -10, -20. Then it held at -27 like a locked jaw. Day after day, the cold stayed seated. Fires were fed without pause. Logs were burned the moment they were split. Chimneys pulled hard, and still the rooms would not warm. In Boone's cabin, heat clung tight to the hearthstones and died a few steps away. 3 feet from the fire, sweat beaded on his neck. 6 feet back, breath smoked in the air. The far corner froze solid. Frost crept up the inside planks like pale vines. A tin cup left on the table froze to the wood. He fed the fire again, and again, and again. The woodpile behind his cabin shrank by the hour. What should have lasted a season vanished in days. Across the clearing, Larkin's fireplace cracked. A sharp report split the night as heated stone met deep freeze. A seam opened along the hearth face. Wind found the gap. Cold air poured through the split like water through a broken dam. Smoke backed into the room, thick and bitter. Larkin worked with numb fingers, packing clay into the widening crack. The patch froze before it could set. Every new log flared bright and died fast. Heat rushed upward. Cold rushed in. The fire roared. The room still chilled. In Kruger's cabin, the thermometer on the wall stalled at 33 degrees. Water stiffened in the wash basin. Blankets stiffened at the edges where frost touched them. His wife slept in layers of coats. His children huddled close to the hearth until their boots steamed. But one step away from the fire, the floorboards burned cold through wool socks. The wall behind them stayed warm. The rest of the cabin belonged to winter. The wind howled down the pass without rest. It slipped through nail holes. It hissed through chinks between logs. It moaned inside chimneys like a living thing. Every standard hearth fought alone against a wall. Heat struck stone and climbed straight upward. The far side of every room stayed hungry. Logs vanished into flame. Ashes piled high. Warmth never spread. Windows filmed over with white frost from the inside. Breath hung in the air even at midday. Men split wood in darkness before dawn. They split wood in starlight after dusk. Arms trembled from the work. Still the piles fell lower. The cold did not bargain. It did not pass through and move on. It settled in place and judged each house by what it could truly hold. Stone cracked. Mortar failed. Smoke choked the rooms meant to be saved by fire. Across the settlement, doors stayed shut and voices stayed low. Every family listened to the wind and counted what wood remained. And for the first time, the old rule began to break. The known way was failing in plain sight. While fires elsewhere were kept alive by fear, Orens was allowed to rest. Each evening, 2 tight bundles of pine were set in the angled hearth. They burned clean and bright, then settled into deep red coals. No midnight feeding, no frantic shoveling of ash. The flame was let to die. The warmth did not. Hours after the last ember dimmed, the room still held steady between 60 and 69 degrees. Nate tested it the same way every night. He waited until the fire was only glow and shadow. Then he crossed the cabin and pressed his palm flat against the far wall. It answered with heat, not sharp heat, not surface warmth that vanished at a touch. A deep, quiet warmth that had traveled through stone and returned. The angled firebox sat dark and patient, no longer giving flame but still giving heat. Air moved in a slow, steady circle. Cool drafts slid down along the ceiling, touched the corner, then rose again warmed, carrying heat across the boards. No dead pockets, no frozen edges. Boone felt it the first time he stepped inside after tending his own failing fire. He expected to find warmth only near the hearth. Instead, the entire room held the same gentle temperature. He walked from door to far wall without feeling the air change. He held his hand against the stone face beside the firebox. It was warm, though the fire had been out for hours. He checked the iron thermometer nailed near the rafters. 66 degrees. He thought of his own cabin. 42 on a good night. Lower by dawn. 24 degrees of difference stood between the two houses. Not by chance. Not by luck. By angle. By mass. By patience. In stone. Outside, the woodpile behind Oren's cabin shrank slowly. 19 days of killing cold passed, and only 1.8 cords were gone. Less wood than Boone had burned in the first week alone. No rush to the axe at midnight. No desperate hunt for dry sticks in the snow. The fire was lit each evening as a habit, not a rescue. Nate slept through the night without waking to feed the flame. Frost never touched the inner walls. Breath did not cloud the air. The hearth did not fight winter in bursts of heat and loss. It stored the day's fire and gave it back through the dark. Boone stood silent beside the corner, palm resting on warm stone. The answer was under his hand. The room was warm without flame, and the truth needed no argument. The knock came after dark, not loud, not urgent, just steady, like a man who had run out of choices. Oren opened the door. Boone stood on the threshold with his wife and 2 children behind him, coats stiff with frost, breath smoking in the lantern light. For a moment, no one spoke. Cold air pushed in around their boots. Warm air pushed back from the room behind Oren. Fireplace gave out, Boone said at last. Walls are freezing through. He did not step inside. He waited. Oren moved aside without a word. They crossed the threshold and the change hit them all at once. Steam lifted from their coats. Ice softened and dripped from hat brims onto the floorboards. The children stopped shivering before their gloves were off. Boone stood still in the middle of the room, eyes searching for the trick. There was no roaring fire, only a bed of red coals in the angled hearth. Yet the air held warm and even. Before the door had time to close fully, another knock came. Kruger stood there, face pale from cold, his brother and sister-in-law behind him, a child wrapped tight in blankets against his chest. He did not ask. He only looked past Oren into the warm light and swallowed hard. The door opened wider. More cold rushed in. More warmth held its ground. 12 people now stood inside a cabin built for far fewer. Boots thudded on the floor. Wet coats hung near the door. Voices stayed low, unsure whether to speak or simply breathe. For a few minutes, the room felt heavier. A faint scent of smoke touched the air. Not thick, not choking, just enough to tighten the chest. Nate noticed first. He looked to Oren. Oren stepped to the hearth and eased the iron damper a fraction closed, then opened it again, finding a new balance in the draft. The smoke smell faded. Air began to move faster up the flue, pulled cleanly through the corner throat. The warmth did not falter. No one spoke of the moment. Boone stood near the far wall, hand pressed against warm plank. Kruger sank onto a stool, eyes wet, staring at the angled firebox, as if it were something alive. Outside, the wind struck the cabin like a hammer against a door. Inside, the temperature never dipped. 64 degrees. Then, 65. The extra bodies added breath and weight to the room. The hearth carried them all. Boone looked at Oren, words caught somewhere between pride and gratitude. "Thank you," he managed. Oren only nodded once and added a single split log to the coals. The flame rose gently, not in panic but in duty. 12 souls warmed their hands in the same steady air. Shame stood in the room beside relief, and no one would ever again mistake that crooked corner for wasted space. Morning came pale and hard, the cold still locked outside the walls. Inside, the coals were low again, yet the room held its warmth. No one called it luck anymore. They wanted to see how it worked. Oren did not reach for tools or diagrams. He bent, picked up a dry blade of grass from the floor near the woodpile, and held it out at arm's length. The thin stem trembled, not from his hand, from the air. He walked slowly away from the hearth, holding the grass steady in front of him. The tip bent toward the corner, then lifted, then drifted sideways. An invisible current traced a soft circle through the room. "Heat moves," Oren said quietly. "It doesn't stay put." He crouched near the angled opening and held the grass low. The blade bowed toward the firebox, then rose as it followed warm air climbing the stone face. He straightened and turned, walking the curve of the room again. The grass followed the same path each time, down from the far wall, across the floor, up along the warm corner, back through the center of the cabin. "Round and round," he said. "Not in one spot." Boone watched, eyes fixed on the small green line as if it were a compass needle. Oren stepped to the far wall and took Boone's hand without ceremony, pressing his palm flat against the boards. "Feel that." The wall was warm, not near the hearth, not beside the fire. Steps away, across the room, still warm. Oren tapped the stone sunk deep into that wall. "Fire hits this side," he said, then pointed across the corner to the matching mass in the other wall. "And that side." He swept his arm across the angled opening. "Heat bounces out here, then sinks into both." Boone pictured the flames striking stone, not once but twice, feeding two buried masses instead of one thin face. "Most hearths heat fast and lose fast," Oren went on. "This holds slow and gives back slow." He pressed Boone's hand harder against the plank. Two walls storing heat, two banks to draw from. Larkin stood nearby, silent, eyes moving from the curved path of the air to the warm boards beneath Boone's hand. No smoke, no flare of flame, just stored warmth moving the long way around. "The heat goes in a circle," Boone said under his breath. Oren nodded once. "Heat goes around," he replied. "Not straight up." For a moment, no one spoke. The mystery thinned into method, the miracle reduced to angles, mass, and time. A roomful of cold men felt the same steady warmth under their palms, and the crooked corner became a lesson any hand could understand. The cold finally loosened its grip, snow softened, then sank into the ground. Icicles thinned and fell from the eaves like spent blades. Doors opened. Cabins breathed again. Boone did not wait for summer. He tore his old hearth down to the floor stones. Cracked rock went outside. Good stone was stacked for a new shape. He worked from a drawing scratched in charcoal across a roof beam inside Oren's cabin. A single diagonal line, two measurements cut deep into the wood, 14 inches into each wall. Nothing fancy, nothing hidden, just numbers that could be followed by any steady hand. Across the pass, Larkin gathered men around a half-built fireplace and turned it before the mortar set. No speeches, no apologies. He simply reset the angle and told them to pack more stone into both walls. From that day on, his work changed. Kruger carried the same measurements to neighbors beyond the ridge. Cabins rebuilt their corners one by one. By the next winter, woodpiles lasted longer. Chimneys burned cleaner. Rooms warmed edge to edge instead of wall to wall. Less timber fell in the forest. More families kept their fuel through the season. When asked whose idea it had been, Oren never answered with a name. He climbed a ladder, pressed a knife into a beam above the hearth, and carved the numbers into the grain. Angle, width, depth. Then he stepped down and went back to work. No plaque was hung. No title was claimed. The corner kept doing what it was built to do. Stone took the fire. Stone gave it back. On that pass, survival stopped being guesswork. It became a measurement cut into wood. Build to live through the night, not to win praise by morning. If you had to trust one fireplace in that winter, would you choose the straight wall or the crooked corner?